Hey, so today we're gonna take a look at uh, path constraints and baking those path constraints. So this is a project that I started for the New Art City lobby. Features amazing blimp design from Asra, so thank you Asra, shout out. And the balloon is going to follow this Bezier curve, this kind of like yellow circle. And I want it to kind of last throughout the duration of the timeline. So the timeline lasts from frame 0 until 2800. So it's kind of like a slow moving rotation. All right, so I've added the curve, and right now the balloon is kind of positioned on the curve because I've done some tests, so it's like located there. But let me show you what happens when I add the object constraint with the balloon as is. So first, the way that this is set up is that this kind of central balloon, this big blue curvy shape, is going to be the thing that's going to drive the animation. All of the other constituent parts are parented to the balloon, and this is if you want to create an animation along a path and then bake it, it's really important that all objects are parented to that kind of centralized object that will follow the path constraint. So top level is the balloon. All objects will be parented to the balloon. The balloon will move along the path. This makes it much easier to bake the animations later on. So really important to have your parenting set up that way. So the first thing that I'm going to do is select, actually the first thing that you'd want to do is select your curve. It can be, in this case, I just made a circle. You can see it here with the Bezier circle. And under the path tab, I've added the total number of frames. So this is like how many frames kind of exist in a timeline within that circle. And I've said that I want there to be 2,800 frames within that circle. So the frame actually will be the thing that drives the position of the blimp between frame 0 and 2,800. The other thing that I've set up while we're talking about time is my stop frame of 2799. So this is one frame before I come back to full circle around my path. This is true. This kind of one frame stop is true for anything that you'd want to do that would be like looping, where you've set up keyframes that are identical to one another, right? So at frame 0 and at frame 2800, I start and stop in the same place. So in my animation, I actually want to cut off one frame right before I get to 2800. Otherwise, I'm going to have two frames that are identical, and it's going to hang. The animation will hang just a little bit at that loop point. So I want to make sure that I'm one frame before the complete rotation comes back to the same position of the start frame. So I have 2,800 frames in my evaluation cycle for the Bezier curve. I have right now this evaluation time. As I move throughout my time frame, my timeline, you can see that I'm actually going from 2,800 to 0 evaluation time. That's because the way the circle was set up, when I tested it, the blimp wanted to go backwards, right? But we wanted it to fly around clockwise, or excuse me, counterclockwise, I guess, depending on, counterclockwise. So I reversed the evaluation time. So I went to frame 0, I wrote in 2,800, and then I right-clicked and I said keyframe. And then I moved my time slider, probably didn't do it that way, probably typed it in, to 2,800. And then I set the evaluation time to 0. And then I right-clicked and then I keyframed. And then that allowed me to reverse the kind of way, it's like counting backwards, right? So that the object moves in the direction that I want it to move. So the way that so you've got your Bezier curve, you've got your objects set up. If there's multiple objects that you want to follow the path, you've parented those objects to a single, kind of centralized object, the parent of the children. And now it's time to add the path constraint. So I've got my object selected. I'm going to go into my constraint tab here, and I'm going to delete. So right now, let's see, did I delete it? There is a follow path constraint, but I think I didn't. Oh, I haven't set a target, so it's just kind of, yeah. So now I'm under this path constraint. I'm going to add a object constraint, and I want it to be a follow path. And I'm going to use this little eyedropper. I can go in and use the eyedropper to select the path, the Bezier curve, or I can click in this little window and then find my my Bezier curve, Bezier circle here. All right, so my blimp disappeared. That is because you can turn this on and off. So the blimp is actually kind of at a location, I don't know where it actually ended up. But the blimp, when it's selected, it has this location of -81x, 7y, 56z. So when you create the path constraint, it's going to keep that kind of offset. So it's going to say that position at frame 0, that's now your new kind of origin. And so whatever those locational data is, your object's going to be offset from the curve in that in those dimensions. So I'm just going to type in 0, 0, 0. Oops. I'm typing in something else, I see. All right, so that's going to put me back on the path. Now when I move along the path, I can see that my little balloon buddy is moving around the path as expected, but it's not facing the direction. So it looks like it's kind of moving around in a circle, but it's not like facing the direction of the curve. In order to turn that on, I need to say follow curve. And then now as I move, it's like the rotation is kind of like following the curve as it moves around. It's just facing inward, so that I can, because everything's parented to my balloon, what I'll do is I'll just rotate it so that it's kind of facing the direction that I want it to face as it moves along the curve. And so kind of like centering it, on this path. And now as I move around, it's facing the path, and everything's moving with it. So yay, I've got the action that I want. The only issue, and this will be wonderful for all rendered animations, but when we're trying to export into other like assets or platforms like New Art City, or if you've got like a VR app, chances are you're going to want to bake this animation in, right? The constraints are great in Blender, in platform, whatever native platform you're working in, but as soon as you're trying to move between things, it can get a little bit funny. So the way that you're going to do that is by baking the animation. We're going to bake the animation only for that top parent blimp. And once that's baked in, the parents, all parenting, like, anything that you're adding over here, like physics or modifiers or any of that fun stuff, that tends to be very platform specific. Things like parenting tend to be a little bit more platform agnostic, and so when we export parented relationships to glTF, we can actually import those constraints in to that packaged file. So rather than baking animation for each one of these objects, it works to just bake the animation for the blimp, and then the parenting constraints will get exported with the glTF file. So the way that we do that is select the blimp, the thing that has the follow path constraint. We go into Object, Animate, Bake Action. And then we want to make sure that we're on frame 1. We end at 2799. I'm going to suggest that we visual keying, that we clear the constraints, and that I think that that's fine. I want to keep the parents. I don't want to overwrite current action. That can mess things up if you have other animations in your scene that have associated animation tracks. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. We'll see how that goes. I'm trying to remember what my export settings were. All right, and now I'm going to say bake data. I want to bake the object and say OK. And it's going to have a little think. It takes depending on your machine and the kind of duration of the animation, it might take a little while. So now you can see all of our rotation, location, and scale have like keys associated with them. If I go up into my graph editor, I can see my Y has this beautiful curve, and so does my X, right? Because we're only moving along the X and Y. We start in the same place we end up. And then when I go down here, it's really dense. You can't even see the keyframes, but literally every frame is now keyed. So that means that this object is no longer following the constraint. We cleared that constraint out. The only thing that's driving the animation are these keyframes, right? And so for every frame, we have an animation that's an associated location and rotation, and that's what's driving the blimp. And then because all of these assets are parented to the blimp, they're following the blimp. So now we want to export as a glTF. So I'm going to select the top level, which is my blimp, and then hold down Shift, and then select all of my children, and then I'm going to go into File, Export, glTF, and I want to use the glTF embedded, and I'm going to include the selected objects. I'm going to use the Y up. I'm going to include the modifiers, UVs, normals, vertex colors, and materials. And for the animation, I'm just going to check animation. I'm going to say, I've tested this a few times. Bake 9. One thing I should have reminded you all, and let's do this now. I'm going to export that glTF. The other thing that I'm going to do is do a file save as. So I have now baked and cleared the constraints. So I should have done that before I even started baking, actually. File, save my Blender file as a new file. I usually name it the same. So this is the kind of native blimp, is RH City blimp. And then every time I baked another animation, I just enumerate the baked animations. And that's important because if I, wanted to go back in and make a modification to the constraint or something, I wouldn't be able to do that now because I've cleared it. One thing I could do, well, let's actually test. Let's test that, and then I'll come back to this file. So this is my RH City Blimp Bake 9. The way that I test my, save that. The way that I test my animation is actually just by bringing it into a new Blender file and then importing some noise out there. And I import, let's see, file, import glTF, and I'm going to find that in my downloads, that Baked 9 glTF, and test the animation here, and beautiful. It's everything's moving together. I can end here at 2800, and so I can, let's see, drag my timer out so I can test that, and it looks great. So now this is an animation that's been a glTF that's ready to import into New York City. So let's go back, hop back into Blender and show you how to clear those keyframes if you did something that you didn't like, right? So and that's why it's really important to before you start baking anything, I would recommend saving your Blender files as the same file name, but then append with a baked nomenclature, so you keep those files different. So file, open recent, that Bake 9, don't need to save that. All right, so let's say I baked everything, but then in New York City, I was like, oh, it's moving too fast, maybe I want it to, or maybe it's moving too slow and I want it to be run for 1500 frames instead of 2500 frames in between. So if I had, if I have this kind of native RH City blimp, I could just kind of mess around with the constraints again. Since I've already baked it, I've lost that path constraint. I can't edit it, so I would need to select the blimp object and then do a box select of the keyframes down here in my dope sheet, and then just hit X and delete keyframes. Now it's just going to sit there. And this is basically where I started the tutorial, right? You could go back in and add that object constraint, the follow path constraint. And you would just need to, like track your Bezier curve. With your object selected, you would need to zero that out in the location. And we're basically at the beginning again, right? Okay, so that is my demo for the follow path constraints. I hope it was useful, and I will upload this and provide maybe this Blender file if it's useful that you can play with. Okay, take care. Bye.